Good morning, everybody. How are we doing? So some of you came back, which is good. That's a good sign, Lisa. And some of you are kind of coming into this. This is your first session. I think you'll be fine. It'll all work out, right? But you'll get at least a 75% because you just missed, right, a quarter of it. So glad to have Lisa back with us again. And I'm going to remind everybody one more time, we are recording this because we do have lots of people that watch this later. We don't live stream things, but we record them and put them out later. So it's really, really important if you want to ask a question that you use the microphone, which will be sitting out here, and that you do that because they can't hear your question or any of your comments on the video. It's very, very challenging to hear that on the video. So please do that, and that's my only word of advice. There's coffee and tea over there if you'd like some. Lisa, take it away.
And for those who missed stuff and regret it, there are always books that
That's right. There's plenty of books. There's a video from last week because I know Julie said she watched it, so you can catch up. And so I also wanted to just say that I have a guest with me this morning. My mother-in-law, Bonnie Davison, and my father-in-law, Mike, came in from Lubbock, Texas this weekend so they could be at my installation, which is tomorrow night at 7. Thank you. Now, if you'd like to write my address for me, that would be great. Actually, I have a rough draft. So last week we talked about some women that often are called pushy by other people. And so today we're going to talk about some more of these rowdy broads of the Hebrew Bible that I have identified as bold women. These are women who often step outside the traditional roles of the female characters in the Hebrew Bible. A couple of them aren't known as mothers. They're known for doing other things, which is rare in the Hebrew Bible. We talked last week, very few women's names, and most of the time they're always connected to the man in their life. Husband, father, son, sometimes even brothers. So let's get started. And we're going to start with a character who's a bit better known of all the women in the Hebrew Bible, and that is the character of Deborah. Deborah is known, but I don't think we often look at her so much as we look at the broader story. And remember, her commander of the military was Barak, who was leading the people of Israel as they were in the Promised Land. I think last week we were still outside the Promised Land. This week we're moving into the Promised Land. So a couple of things about Deborah. She has 2 chapters in Judges in which she is part of the story. The first one is Judges 4, which is a prose story about Deborah and Barak and the Israelites' defeat of King Jabin and his army. When you're in the book of Joshua, you often see this pattern that the people mess up, a foreign enemy oppresses them, the Holy raises up someone to be the hero to defeat that outside force, and then there is a time of peace. And they were led by people who we call judges, shofatim in Hebrew, which isn't really what we think of as a judge today. Some of them are more like heroes from romance-like stories, not romantic, but romance-like stories. There are multiple male judges. There is only one female judge, and that is Deborah. Judges 5 is the same story told in poetry. It is the song of Deborah and Barak that talks about the defeat of their enemy. And there are a couple of differences between how the story is told, but we would expect that because when you're telling a story as prose, it's one way of telling it. When you move into poetry, poetry has a lot of the condensing of the story. Try to say this as much as you can with as few words as possible. And so we'll look at both of those a little bit, but not like reading our Bibles today, because I noticed not everybody brought their Bible. Some of you may have. If you have your phone, you probably have a Bible. Another thing, there is a question when Deborah is introduced in Judges 4 if she was married. Judges 4:4 is typically saying Deborah, the wife of Lapidot. In Hebrew, it's Eshet Lapidot. And the thing you need to know is that in biblical Hebrew, I think I may have mentioned this last week, that the word for woman can also be translated as wife. So Eve was the man's woman, but we often translate it as wife. So in this setup, we could say woman instead of wife. This name, Lapidot, is not a name found anywhere else in the Hebrew Bible, but it does have a word that means more like light, flames, a candle. And so some have suggested, and I'm one of them, that we could translate Eshet Lapidot as woman of flames. It's also often connected to keeping the flame, eternal flame, in the synagogue or the temple later on. And we could also call her woman of lightning, or my favorite, fiery woman. And I think as you read through the story, Deborah is definitely a fiery woman. She is also a lightning bolt in that she, through her prophetic gift from the Holy, is the one who gets Barak to go into battle against this big foreign army that has chariots and all these things that really are not easy enemies to defeat, especially if you're a group of people who are just taking stake in this promised land. And also, it's interesting, her husband is never mentioned again. Never says anything about her husband. So I like to think that maybe Deborah was not married. Perhaps as a female judge, you couldn't be married and have children because that would take all your time. They did not have daycare. They did not have someone. So women in this time period, the Bronze Age, were really busy all the time. Not only you have to cook your meals, but you had to make the utensils to cook them in and the utensils to eat. You had to weave the material to make the clothing and all these other things. Oh, and you're running after a bunch of children. So it would make being a judge a little hard. So I've scattered in some artwork, again, of what Deborah is often portrayed as being. You see her there giving her speech on the steps there. Now, when I talk about Deborah, I see at least 4 roles that she portrays in the story. I mentioned that she is a judge. She's not quite the same charismatic leader as the other judges. Think about somebody like Samuel or that kind of person. And actually, when she's first introduced, she is sitting under the palm tree giving judgments for the people. So she actually looks more like today's judge. People would come to Deborah to help them settle disputes, to adjudicate their conflicts. So she is a judge in that sense as well. She is also called a prophet. She is the second female named as a prophet in the Hebrew Bible. The first one was Miriam. She does have a divine message she receives, and she goes to deliver that to Barak. The message is, despite what it might look like, God will deliver King Jabin's army into the hands of the Israelites. Now that's sort of like, how do I want to say this in football terms? Who was it that Tulsa played on Saturday? Sort of like that kind of battle. You're going up against somebody who's got more money, more strength, more power. And so when she tells Barak that God has said you should go up against King Jabin in battle because you will be victorious, Barak was like, well, I don't know about that. I've seen the battlefield. They have all these things. And so in order for Barak to lead the army into battle, Deborah has to go with them, which I think is, Barak saying, okay, if you think we're going to do this, you come with us. Let's put your money or your body where your mouth is, so to speak. And actually, she does go. And so that's the other role that people often overlook. She is not just a judge. She is in many ways like the general of the army. I doubt she fought in battle. She might have, but sometimes those leaders of armies would sit up on the high hill and wait until they defeated everybody, and then they would come along and celebrate. And, she was right. They do defeat this mighty enemy because of how God works in that story, and Deborah going with them helps that to happen. This is an image from Sunday school material of Deborah and Barak having this kind of conversation, and Barak, I'm sure, is portrayed as going, what? Who are you talking to? You've been sitting out here under this palm tree a little too long, Deborah. So, the other place that we, as I said, hear about Deborah is in Judges 5. Now, Judges 5, the poetic text is celebrating Deborah as well as Barak and God's role in the victory over a foreign enemy. It talks about tribes who came to help and tribes that didn't, because remember, at this point, they really are a tribal confederacy. They are not a united nation at this point in the story of the Hebrew Bible. Every tribe kind of does their thing. And some suggest a term that I always like to throw out when I'm playing Scrabble. It is an amphictyony. There you go. Amphictyony means a loose association of tribes that come together for common goals. So in Israel, it would be coming together when there's an enemy they have to defeat, and to come together for worship. So we don't know, that's just part of how they're portrayed. But in this celebratory song that Deborah and Barak sings, there is a line that says, blessed be Deborah, a mother in Israel. The phrase mother in Israel is one that occurs at one other place or two. In 2 Samuel 20:19, this is a story nobody preaches on, nobody reads about. It's Joab pursuing Sheba, who is someone on the run, and they're about to attack a city to get this guy, and we have this woman, a mother of Sheba, who comes, or mother of Abel, who comes and says, don't destroy the city, we'll give you who you're looking for. And she does. Very graphically, they get the guy they're looking for, but she saves her city. And she is described in the Hebrew Bible not only as a mother in Israel, but as a wise woman. And there are a few wise women in the Hebrew Bible labeled as such, and their particular role we're still discerning. Some think that a wise woman was someone who maybe collected all the stories and lessons of the people's past, and when appropriate times came, she'd pull out a story or something else that she could remind the people of what they needed to do or what God had required of them. So Deborah is called a mother in Israel. This place, a city, is considered a mother in Israel. Claudia Camp, who taught religious studies and Hebrew Bible at TCU, and we won't talk about the Texas Christian University game at all, But she talks about this wise woman of 2 Samuel. We're going to look at another wise woman if we have time. And she describes a wise woman as a good counselor, willing to step forward as a commander in battle, who seeks the unity and covenantal shalom of God's people. Another scholar, Susan Ackerman, in her book Warrior, Dancer, Seductress, Women in Judges and Biblical Israel, says that Deborah would fit this description of a wise woman. And this phrase, mother of Israel, if it's only used to refer to a city in that 2 Samuel text, does mother in Israel mean she's a biological mother? Or does it mean an honorific title that you would give because she had in many ways protected her people, as one might imagine mothers do? The other thing is, in the Hebrew Bible, she never shows up in a genealogy of having any children. Now, later traditions have some stories about Deborah, but in the Hebrew Bible, she is introduced as a prophet, a judge, a warrior, a mother in Israel, but she's never, ever described as having children. And that, remember, she's not necessarily the wife of Lapidoth. She could be a fiery woman. So again, if this is not a biological phrase, mother in Israel, then what is the poem trying to do by calling her mother in Israel? In my generous side, as I said, I think it's recognizing her as a leader and a protector of the people. In my cynical side, I wonder if the biblical storytellers weren't happy that she was child-free, and they had to make her a mother in the end. But I have no evidence of that. That is what I've called before motherizing someone who is never described as a mother, but we want to make her a mother, just so she fits within our description. I love this artwork of the battle of the Israelites with King Jabin, and this is Deborah right here. So they do portray her as being a bit more involved in the fighting. Yes, ma'am. Oh, sorry. Here we go. Thank you, Corinthia. I think it has to be turned on.
I think it's on. Yeah, okay. I was looking and I knew it had to be like hidden behind somebody.
Right here.
Yeah.
We'll just put it right in the middle.
Well, or
we
even
won't
like
make you come up. Yeah.
But the idea of her being attached to the concept of mother made me think of course, Game of Thrones.
I've never
Mother
watched
of
Game
Dragons.
Uh-huh.
But it also makes me wonder if, sometimes the littlest thing in language can change tons of things. Like, is it mother of Israel or mother to?
It's mother in. The preposition is bait, which can mean in, with, at, as, but not to. So.
But still, that kind of influences that it might not be specifically
biological. Yeah.
So.
Good. Thank you. That's great. So, as I said, Deborah and Barak and the Israelites go. The army gets stuck in some mud and they flee, or some of them flee. In particular, their leader flees from the battlefield because, leader doesn't go down with the ship, right? And they celebrate this victory, and there's peace during the rest of Deborah's rule. As I said, these are a couple of things. And I do think, again, I have written this book that some of you have heard about, More Than a Womb, Child-Free Women in the Hebrew Bible as Agents of the Holy, or the Divine. I can't remember which word I use. But in it, I talk about these female characters who are never described as mother and never described as barren. And so leaves open the possibility that their stories are not related to their reproductive abilities, Their stories are related to some other role that they played in the stories of Israel, and in particular, roles that are often held by men. Judge, prophet, military commander. And thinking through, if you're trying to be available to all people when you're sitting under the palm, giving judgments, if you're going to be a prophet and you're going to go into military battle, would there have been time for her also to be a mother? Now, some scholars, women scholars, have suggested maybe she was a mother before she became a judge, a prophet, and a military commander. I'm not saying it's impossible. I just think, why is that necessary? Why can she not be remembered as these other things? So, now we can't talk about Judges 4 and 5 without talking about another major character in these 2 chapters, and that is the woman named Jael. Has anybody heard of Jael? A few of us, not everybody. We don't preach on her very much. She's just a side part of the story, but I love the images I can find. Her part of the story is verses 17 to 22 in Judges 4. So remember I talked about the leader of the army fleeing while they were being destroyed by the Israelites? Well, that leader's name was Sisera. And so the story goes that Sisera fled away on foot while his soldiers were dying on the battlefield and came to the tent of Jael, wife of Heber, the Kenite. For there was peace between King Jabin of Hazor and the clan of Heber the Kenite. So Sisera is running away. He sees this tent in the area that he thinks he has good diplomatic relationships with, and comes to her door, or her tent flap. She comes out to meet him and said, "Turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, have no fear." So he turned aside to her into the tent. She covered him with a rug, and he said, "Please give me a little water, for I'm thirsty." She opened a skin of milk, gave him milk, and covered him. And he said, "Stand at the entrance of the tent. If anybody comes and asks you, 'Is anyone here?' say no." So first off, Jael's being very hospitable. She's following the rules of ancient Near Eastern hospitality. She offers shelter. She offers drink. In the poetic version of the story, she gives him food as well as drink and covers him up and promises to protect him. That's what ancient Near Eastern hospitality was like. You welcome a stranger, give them water, give them food, give them shelter, and once they're under your roof, you protect them at all costs. She starts out as a good host. She doesn't end up as the best host from Sisera's vision. So in verse 21, Jael, wife of Heber, took a tent peg and a hammer in her hand, went softly to Sisera, and drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground. He was lying fast asleep from weariness, and he died. Now, a couple of things I like to throw out here. One, I think this is the origin of the term splitting headache. I don't know about you, but when I had migraines, it felt like an ice pick was going right through my brain. Guess I should have named my migraine Jael. The other thing I love to tell, and this is just many, many years ago, not at Phillips Theological Seminary, there was a student who did not like to pay much attention in class, in the in-person classroom class. And so when I was reading this dramatically and drove the tent peg into the temple all the way down, this person thought, well, I'm just going to show what I know. He raised his hand, and I said, what? No, I actually said, yes. And he said, I thought the temple wasn't built yet. He was correct, it wasn't. But obviously he missed everything but that one word. And so when we read this story, I have a visceral reaction, just, driving a tent peg into someone's head. It's not my way of dealing with conflict. But there are a couple of things I think we need to note. Jael seems to be all alone at her tent. Her husband is probably fighting in the battle that Sisera just fled. And so here you are, a woman, very vulnerable, and this military guy comes seeking shelter, and she offers it, but that would have been extremely dangerous back then. It's extremely dangerous today. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't welcome somebody I didn't know into my house and offer them hospitality and then, let them do with me what they will. Another part of the ancient Near Eastern custom of hospitality is that the guest has obligations just like the host. And one of those obligations is you don't bring trouble upon the house of the host. So Sisera isn't being the best guest either. They're also not supposed to ask for anything. The host is just supposed to say, here's some water, and let me give you this. Remember Abraham and Sarah at the tents of Mamre when those three strangers show up and he runs and offers them something to drink, something to eat, and shelter to rest. So Sisera is not the guest we would want in our house. Jael probably knows too. I mean, there was a what shall we call it, a gossip chain in the ancient world. She's probably heard that the Israelites have defeated Sisera's army, and so he's running to seek shelter from the Israelites. And if the Israelites show up at your tent and you're harboring the enemy, how's that going to turn out for Jael? Not good at all. So she sees the writing on the wall, so to speak, and says, I'm going to finish him off. And so, sure enough, Barak came in pursuit of Sisera, and Jael went out to meet him and said to him, come, I'll show you the man whom you are seeking. And so he went into her tent, and there was Sisera lying dead with the tent peg in his temple. So she's a hero in this story. Yes, ma'am. Don't forget. She also did it softly, yes. Yes, she tiptoed in, and you wonder what was in that milk maybe that she gave him, that he didn't wake up at all. I don't know, but anyway. So on that day, God subdued King Jabin of Canaan before the Israelites. Now, I just have to show you a couple other things when you go looking for imagery of Jael. A precious moment figure for Jael. She's got her hammer, the tent peg. She looks so innocent. In chapter 5, she is mentioned in the poem, most blessed of women be Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Of tent-dwelling women, most blessed. He asked water, she gave him milk, she brought him curds in a lordly bowl. So that's where it says she fed him too. And then she put her hand to the tent peg and her right hand to the workman's mallet, and she struck Sisera a blow. She crushed his head. She shattered and pierced his temple. He sank, he fell. He lay still at her feet. At her feet he sank, he fell. Where he sank, there he fell dead. In case you didn't get, he was dead. This is also part of poetry in Hebrew is repetition, parallelism. So that's part of why we're told multiple times that he sank, he fell, and then ultimately was dead. And then this is yet one more image of Jael at the tent door with him having been taken care of. Are there any comments or questions about Deborah or Jael before I move on?
That precious moments is just too much.
I know. People think I created it, but I found it long before there were computer skills for me to create that. Now, I never went to the Precious Moments Memories or whatever. They have a museum, don't they, in Arkansas? Missouri. I knew it was one, and I've never been there, so I don't know if that really is something. I doubt it is, but okay. You would recall that one. Not really. Okay. I was going to say, not really what you want to get a newborn girl to put in her nursery of the Precious Moments figure of Jael. All right, well, let's move on. The next person we're going to look at, most people have not heard of. You all may be different. And so I often start my class on women in the Hebrew Bible with a quiz, which I didn't make you all do. But it's a quiz about naming women based on descriptions. And throughout the decades now that I've been teaching, people always say, well, I know the husband's name, but I don't know her name. I know his name, I don't know her name. I will say, it's interesting, because when I teach Intro to Hebrew Bible, I don't do like most intro textbooks and just follow the male characters through the story. I like to lift up some women along the way. And this past spring, I taught women in the Hebrew Bible. We did the quiz at the beginning of the first weekend we met, and the scores were just surprisingly high. Now, I'm not taking credit for that, but I'm at least saying they have now heard of women in ways they may not have before. So, this is the woman named Rizpah. Anybody know Rizpah? A couple of you might, most of you probably don't. Doesn't show up in the lectionary. It's a really powerful story. Again, we have a named woman, which is so rare we have to pay attention. So, Rizpah, we read about first in 2 Samuel chapter 3, verses 7 through 11, and then in chapter 21, 1 through 14. That's her main story. She is identified as a concubine of King Saul, who at this point in the story is dead. What we mean by concubine is interesting. The Hebrew is pilagesh. It can mean a secondary wife. Remember, polygamous marriages were very popular back then. It's a higher level than a slave, not much, but higher. Often, a concubine will be used to produce offspring if a main wife can't do it. And it does give you some economic privilege than, say, the rest of the king's harem, if you are a concubine. So Rizpah is introduced. Now Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, daughter of Aiah, and Ishbaal said to Abner, so this is right after Saul dies, and Abner, one of his sons, has tried to take the concubine of his father to sleep with her. Now, this is a power move. Saul has died, and the sons are going to want to figure out who's going to take the throne. And so if you take his woman, you have a closer step into taking the throne. And that upsets one of the other sons. Why have you gone into my father's concubine? In this scene, Rizpah is just a pawn in a political game. She's something that these sons are fighting over in order to gain their father's throne. Now, of course, we know they're not going to get the throne because David's going to get the throne. But they don't know that in this story. I was amazed to find books about Rizpah that I just, again, we haven't heard of her in the church, but somebody heard of her and wrote books about her. The next time we show up is that later passage where it says, David is now on the throne. There was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year. And David inquired of the Lord. Remember back then, everything came from God, a famine or a feast. And so David goes to God to say, hey, what do I need to do about this famine? What have we done wrong? How do we fix it? And the Lord said, there is blood guilt on Saul and on his house because he put the Gibeonites to death. Side note about the Gibeonites, they were one of the groups of people who were living in the Promised Land, the Cisjordan region, who the Israelites made a covenant with, not to destroy them. They got to live, whereas other groups of people were destroyed or ran out. The Gibeonites had peace with the Israelites. So Saul did indeed try and actually killed some of the Gibeonites, which was breaking the covenant that existed between the two groups of people. And so David goes to the Gibeonites and says, what do you want? How do we make this square and hopefully end the famine? And the Gibeonites say, it's not a matter of money, neither it is for us to put anyone to death in Israel. So they know they can't execute people in another group, another nation. And so he says, what do you say that I should do for you? And they said to David, the man who consumed us and planned to destroy us so that we should have no place in all the territory of Israel, let 7 of his sons be handed over to us, and we will impale them before the Lord. And the king said, we will impale them before the Lord at Gibeon on the mountain of the Lord. And David says, I'll hand them over. David, you gotta love him. He's rarely putting his people first. So the king took 2 sons of Rizpah, the concubine who bore these 2 sons to Saul, Armoni and Mephibosheth, and 5 sons of Saul's other daughter, Merab, whom she bore to Adriel, son of Barzillai, the Maholathite. And he gave them into the hands of the Gibeonites, and they impaled them on the mountain before the Lord. Now, we understand what impale means. There'd be like a sharp post, and the body goes down on it. I don't want to sound too crude, but it's like a shish kebab, except the body is put on them. Most artists will not render this. So you see, this is Rizpah, and they have her sons and Merab's sons being hanged instead. So they take them out, they impale them on the mountain of the Lord, and David leaves them there, which the custom would have been to take their bodies and bury them. Remember, these are the sons of the former king, or the grandsons in the second case. So they deserve a proper burial, but David doesn't do that. Now, why? Well, it could be that he was trying to teach people a lesson. It could be that, well, you know, with Saul's descendants, male descendants gone, there's fewer people to challenge the throne. For whatever reason, he just leaves them out there. That's disgraceful to the dead bodies. The day they were put to death was the first days of harvest at the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Rizpah, here she is, a grieving concubine, a grieving mother, and a grieving aunt of Merab's sons, has to do something. And as this concubine of the deceased king, she can't go to David and say, put those bodies in a proper burial spot. She cannot go to David and say, you are doing something wrong. Because if she did, at best, he'd just ignore her. And at worst, she could be killed. You don't go to the king and demand something, especially not as a female in this time in the story. So she does what she can. So Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah, took sackcloth and spread it on a rock for herself from the beginnings of harvest until the rain fell on them from the heavens. He goes on to say, She did not allow the birds of the air to come, because scavengers are going to come and desecrate the bodies. She did not allow the birds of the air to come on the bodies by day, or the wild animals by night. Day and night, Rizpah was there on that sackcloth, protecting the bodies not only of her sons, but also of her nephews. A couple of other images. Oh, I forgot to say. And this, no, the one back. This is a Christian rendering, so they're crucified instead of impaled, which really wasn't a practice of the Israelites at that time. That was a Roman practice. I didn't finish it. So it says, day and night she did this. And finally, David, the king, took note of what Rizpah was doing. And however you want to say, she motivated him, either by guilting him into doing the right thing or by reminding him that, you really should give these people a proper burial. David finally says, go and take those bodies and bury them. Rizpah, who could do nothing officially to make this happen, did the only thing she could. She, in many ways, in my mind, is a prophet, but she is the prophet who uses action or symbols, like lying on your side or cutting off your beard, all those things that other prophets do. Rizpah is doing a prophetic act. She is giving a message to King David that he needs to do the right thing. And the interesting part is the Bible says only after he has buried everyone do the rains fall. I remind folks that, remember, the Holy didn't say kill the descendants of Saul. That is what the Gibeonites said. It really wasn't what the Holy wanted. But once the right thing is done, after her prophetic act, and the bodies are taken care of, do the rains finally fall from heaven. Rizpah. See, and we don't know her story. Isn't this an amazing story about what she does to get justice for her children? It reminds me of a lot of images we have even today of mothers who have lost children who are trying to help people remember their dead children through their actions as well as through their speaking and writing. Any questions about Rizpah? All right. Let me see what time we're at. Oh, we got a little bit more. Let's move on. So we're going to actually talk about the second or the other wise woman in the Hebrew Bible. And this is the wise woman of Tekoa. Note, even though these wise women have important roles, they don't get names. But that's probably okay. They just knew her as the wise woman. In some cultures, it might be she's sort of the matriarch or the grandmother or the auntie or someone who is known for wisdom. And once again, we're jumping back just a little bit. We are back in, we're in 2 Samuel. No, we're not jumping back. We are in 2 Samuel 14, and this is David's reign. And what has happened is one of David's sons has raped his half-sister Tamar. And David does nothing about this. Even after the rape, he does nothing. And so one of his other sons, who is actually Tamar's whole brother, not half-brother, brother by the same mother, kills the one who has raped Tamar, and then has to go on the run, because the king is going to kill him, execute him. And so time passes, and David seems to be regretting that he's lost his son who had to go on the run. And he seems troubled. And his military person, Joab, decides to try something to help his ruler have peace, have some hope. And so Joab sent to Tekoa and brought from there a wise woman. And he says to her, pretend to be a mourner, put on mourning garments, do not anoint yourself with oil, but behave like a woman who has been mourning many days for the dead. Go to the king and speak to him as follows. And the text says, and Joab put words into her mouth. Now, the word translated as words, devarim, can also mean things, matters. It doesn't have to mean like he put the exact words. It could also mean he told her what the situation was and what he was trying to get from the king. And so sure enough, she shows up dressed as a woman mourning, a mother in mourning. She goes to David. She fell on her face. She does the proper obeisance and says, help, O king. And the king asked her, what is your trouble? And she answered, alas, I am a widow. My husband is dead. Your servant had 2 sons. They fought with one another in the field, and there was no one to part them. And one struck the other and killed him. And now the whole family has risen against your servant. They say, give up the man who struck his brother so that we may kill him for the life of his brother whom he murdered, even if we destroy the heir as well. Thus they would quench my one remaining ember and leave to my husband neither name nor remnant on the face of the earth. Now, the first thing I like to remind folks, if, let's say, Joab didn't tell her all the words to say, I think it's powerful that the story she tells, 2 brothers are out in the field fighting or doing something, and one kills the other. Sound familiar? Cain and Abel? Again, there's no community back there to seek the death of the other one. And I do like to go back and point out that when Cain killed Abel, the holy didn't kill him. The holy said, you will live a different life now, but didn't put the murderer to death. Humans sometimes aren't quite as quick to pick up on that. And so what the people want to do in this story, again, it's probably a parable or something, is if they kill her other son, she has no one to take care of her. Her husband's probably is dead in the story, remember. She's not the actual widow. She's playing the part of the widow in this scene. If her husband is dead and they kill both her other sons, she has nobody to take care of her. And that's really a problem for this female being very vulnerable in the ancient culture. And so she's like, don't let them kill my only remaining ember. I love that kind of imagery. So the woman is playing the part of this widow who's trying to save the life of her son. And King David says to the woman, go to your house and I will give orders concerning you. The woman of Tekoa said to the king, on me be the guilt, my lord the king, and on my father's house. Let the king and his throne be guiltless. And the king said, if anyone says anything to you, bring them to me, and they will never touch you again. And please, my lord, may the king, the Lord your God, keep the Lord your God in mind, so the avenger of blood may kill no more, and my son not be destroyed. And David says, not a hair shall be touched on your remaining son's head. So it's a good day for King David. He's made a very wise, powerful judgment saying this son who killed his brother should be forgiven and taken back in. Well, the wise woman of Tekoa isn't done with David. The woman said, "Why have you planned such a thing against the people of God? For in giving this decision, the king convicts himself, inasmuch as the king does not bring his banished one home again." Ha! She got David to take the trap. He has now rendered a judgment that actually makes him guilty. We must all die. We are like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up, but God will not take away a life. God will devise plans so as not to keep an outcast banished forever from God's presence. Now I have come to say this to my lord the king, because the people have made me afraid. Your servant thought, I will speak to the king, and it may be that the king will perform the request of his servant. The king will hear, deliver his servant from the hand of the one who would cut off both me and my son. And your servant thought, the word of my lord the king will set me at rest, for my lord the king is like the angel of God, discerning good and evil. To the Lord your God be with you. She chose the perfect story from the stories of the people to set up David, to say you need to bring your other son home. Sounds a lot like what the prophet Nathan did to David when David took Bathsheba and had Bathsheba's husband Uriah, not Uriah, is that right? Yeah, Uriah. Thank you. I had Uzziah in my hat. Uriah, and had Uriah killed. And remember, Nathan came and told him a story about a powerful man taking a less powerful, and then says, you are that man. That's essentially what the wise woman of Tekoa does here. But I really love this line. God will not take away a life, but will devise plans so as not to keep an outcast banished forever from God's presence. It's a great lesson, not only for David, but for everyone else who hears the story. God doesn't desire to kill someone. God wants to bring reconciliation. God wants to bring them back into the whole people of God. So the wise woman of Tekoa has done her job, and she goes back home to be. What do you think? She's pretty amazing, isn't she? King David. I'm not picking on David, okay, but let's face it, David is human. David makes mistakes. Interesting thing about David, unlike King Saul, is when David is confronted with what he's done wrong, he usually turns around, repents, and does the right thing. Not bad for a king. Any other comments? You're going to remember Rizpah and the wise woman of Tekoa, aren't you? All right, just one last one. We've got a few minutes. And this is another one of my favorite. Well, they're all my favorite. Let me just put it that way. But I want to say a word about Huldah. A lot of people don't know the story of Huldah. I only have known one woman named Huldah. She was at one of the churches I served while we were in Kentucky. She was an elder in the church. And Huldah didn't seek the limelight. She wasn't one who talks to hear herself talk. But when she had something to say, people listened to her. So in studying the character of Huldah, I keep her in mind. There are two parallel versions of her story, 2 Kings 22, 14 to 20, and 2 Chronicles 34, 22 to 28. Those are parallels. Remember, Samuel, Kings, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles are basically telling the stories of Israel, but Chronicles does the Reader's Digest version and cleans up David a lot and Solomon a little bit, whereas the Samuel and Kings are a little more brutally honest. She is now also identified as a prophet, the third named prophet in the Hebrew Bible. There are actually four that the word Nebiah is used to describe. The fourth one is Noadiah, who is mentioned in Nehemiah 6:14. Later, Jewish traditions name more women as prophets. Sarah is called a prophet. and a couple of others that we may not think about, but there is a list of female prophets out there. She is introduced as the wife or woman of Shallum, who is described basically as the royal wardrobe keeper. And I like to think she's a prophet and he does the laundry. What a great setup for a story about a woman in the Hebrew Bible. Huldah is a prophet. She is also probably a scribe of some sort. She can read, which would have been not the norm for many people in this story. So she is set in the story about King Josiah's attempts to renew Israel, to get them on the right track, to eradicate the religious apostasy and political corruption that's been going on in Jerusalem. And he comes along trying to reform the kingdom and get the people in right relationship with the holy. And so part of that is cleaning up the temple, because people have been bringing in statues of other gods and other things that aren't supposed to be in the holy space. And while the people are cleaning up the temple, they find a scroll. And so Shaphan is given the scroll that he takes to the king, and he reads it, and it's bad news. Now, what this scroll is a matter of debate. Some people think it was Deuteronomy. Some people think it might have been a version of some portions of the Torah. It may have been something that was listing all those commandments and how to live out this covenantal relationship. And so basically, when the king reads it, he realizes how far the people have fallen, how they have broken the covenant, and they need to get their act together. But Josiah wants to make certain this is authentic and not just something that somebody scribbled on a piece of paper and left it in the corner in the temple. So his men are given the task to find someone to authenticate it, and they go straight to Huldah the prophet. Now, this is the 7th century, so Jeremiah is also a prophet at this time. Didn't go to Jeremiah. She interprets the scroll, which, as I said, means she can read it and understand it, and declares that it is indeed holy writ. And she offers a prophetic message to the king, which says, essentially, yeah, the kingdom's going to fall. But Josiah, because you're righteous, you will not be a victim of this attack. At this point, it's the Babylonians that are on the horizon, marching to take over that part of the ancient Near East. In the Chronicler's version, it goes on to say that this word that she gives to Josiah actually is an impetus for that reformation in Judah. Because once Josiah hears about this, he reads it in the gathering of the people, and they all repent and start doing the best they can to get right with God. Now, Josiah's end is not what Huldah said it would be. He actually is killed. So there's, in the Chronicler's version, they give a little explanations. He goes out to meet the king and talk this through, or military commander, and in the end, he doesn't listen to the words that have been given to him, and he is murdered. But he still was the last great king of Judah. And so Huldah then is this wonderful person who, as I said, I don't know why I did that, who actually, again, can read, can interpret, is sought for her advice and guidance from the king's men. I like to think she was also our first textual critic in Hebrew Bible studies. You know, textual criticism is trying to get back to the best version of the Hebrew text that you can. We don't call it original because we'll never get back to the original, but the closest that we can when there are textual differences. So consultant to the king, the high priest. I like to point out here, she is a wife but never called a mother. Though later she is known, I can't remember who she's the mother of. And again, if Huldah had followed the acceptable path, would she have been able to gain an education and be able to read and interpret sacred texts and be a consultant for religious and political leaders? And this is the gate of Huldah in the wall around Jerusalem, where she is said to have taught, according to the traditions. Some have even said that Josiah might have been a student of hers. That's the legend. Yes. Yeah. Hers is. Yeah. You want to say more about that? Or are you just curious that it is? I don't know. Maybe protection. This is, what exists today. So it could have been protection. It could have been something, a later addition when they were, the Romans took over. I'm not certain of that part of archaeological history. But there's steps there that you can go and sit on, and they talk about the tradition of Huldah being a teacher. So, all right, that's all I have for you today. I think next week we are going to look at some risque women in the Hebrew Bible. I'll just bait you a little bit. Don't you want to come back? Thank you all very much. Have a great day.